Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, the podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we are going to be discussing true crime with our special guest, Ashley. So thank you for joining us today, Ashley.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We are very excited to have you on the show, and I'm going to apologize to our audience very quickly. I sound like I'm dying. My son decided to bring home an illness, and we have recovered from it, but our voices have not come back yet. So I am very sorry for sounding this bad, but we'll make it through. So before we jump into the discussion, though, today, Ashley, would you like to quickly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Hello, my name is Ashley. I host Fuck That, which is a true crime podcast. I've been doing it for about 4 years now. And I cover true crime and spooky stories, but about 50% of the cases that I cover, I work directly with victims' families, trying to bring awareness and give them voices about whatever they faced. That's pretty much it. I'm simple.
I love that because, with the world that gets so caught up in true crime and like the podcasts, the shows on TV, the everything else, you like to think that somewhere out there, someone is actually trying to help these people because you get like a little distanced from it, right? When we're watching it on TV and we're listening to it on a podcast, but these are real people and this is a real family that's going through something super traumatic. And, we have to think about that and think about how we can help those people and not just get caught up in the glory of the true crime part of it, right? So thank you so much for what you do.
Oh, thanks. It's no problem. Least I could do.
So looking at true crime then, because like Amanda said, it's a big thing. People love true crime. So what is it, Ashley, that really makes people have this interest in true crime and consume true crime media so often?
I think about this a lot, and I think there's a lot of different facets to it. I was talking to somebody I know that works in mental health, and we were talking about how it's Halloween, and my favorite movies are scary movies. In fact, I watch them all year long. And he had said that it's interesting because there's strong correlations with people that have had backgrounds in trauma or have lived through traumatic experiences, and they tend to love horror more than people that haven't. So I almost wonder if maybe it's a little bit of that. And especially for the female audience, I wonder if it's maybe a bit of hypervigilance. The more we know about it, the more we know what can happen, where, how. Maybe it kind of makes us feel like we're a little bit more protected with that knowledge. And then I think there's that really unfortunate population who love dark and morbid things that happen to people, and they want to consume as much of it as they can, no matter how gory or just not needed to be said it may be. And there's a population of people that don't really look at it as experiences that have happened to real people. They just consume it because they're into very, very morbid things.
Yeah, as someone who really also enjoys horror films, it's interesting to kind of hear it too, that those who've experienced trauma may tend to view horror films more often too. I don't have that kind of background. I'm just weird and just love horror films because I like being scared. But we've mentioned it a few times in previous episodes when we talk about media, how media is a great tool for not only building empathy, but also as a learning tool. And I do think that's kind of like where they're coming from for women, especially when it comes to true crime. Our society teaches women that they are supposed to be afraid of men. They are supposed to be able to defend themselves and be able to fight it off. But true crime is giving them the avenue of seeing, okay, what did this person do that didn't work? So now I can do something opposite of that. So that way, if I'm in that situation, it will work for me.
Yeah.
Right. We watch a, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say we watch a horror movie and every single time you're like, don't run up the stairs, you dummy. Like, don't run into the dark room, you dummy. So we're using all of these things that we see as a way to be like, that's something that obviously isn't going to work. I know it's not going to work. My brain has already programmed, don't do that thing.
Yeah, and I think especially too, particularly for women that experience crimes that are sexual in nature, we see time and time again so many instances of them not getting justice for a myriad of reasons. Maybe they were judged by police for a past decision they made. Maybe there's just not enough evidence, which is why you see so many people pursue it in civil court instead. So I also wonder if it's maybe a sense of if this happens to me, I likely won't be protected by the system that's meant to protect me. So how can I protect myself and prevent myself from getting into a situation like that?
Yeah, and bringing that to back to the horror film just a little bit, because that's also the final girl, right? So your slasher films that have the final girl, it's always a character who's attacked by a man with a penetrating weapon, typically, who isn't believed by law enforcement or her father or friends or that male figure that she reports to until they have to deal with it themselves. And then by then it's too late. So she has to solve this on her own. So even that final girl trope kind of plays into that on how women tend to consume true crime or may tend to consume true crime because their lived experiences are already telling us, well, people aren't going to believe me. So I need to be more vigilant and keep myself protected because the people that are supposed to do it aren't going to.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I wonder too if, because like, so we said people who um tend to like horror movies, maybe like true crime more, things like that, are people who have experienced trauma in the past. I don't have a psychology degree. I'm not a therapist. I don't know for sure, but I'm wondering, and I feel like this makes sense, um, when our brains are like, oh, scary thing is happening, my body's going to react a certain way, whether it's to freeze or to flee or whatever. Um, and sometimes I know in like therapy, they'll say you have to kind of retrain your nervous system to know that not everything out there is going to hurt you specifically. So maybe there's a little catharsis in there where we can see these bad things happen. Our adrenaline can start going. We can get scared, but we know that we are still safe in this moment. And we can kind of use that to help try and retrain our nervous system to know that not every scary thing means bad thing is happening to me and I might still be safe. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely think a lot of women experience hypervigilance on a daily basis, walking with their keys in their hand, like Wolverine, if they know
Mhm.
that they're walking alone in a parking lot. Not walking with headphones in both ears or with the volume lower, so that way you can make sure that there's nobody approaching you from behind. I mean, these are things that I think we all can relate to thinking about on a daily basis whenever we're in public. Something as small as pulling up to a gas pump, like looking who is at the pumps around you. So I think, it's normal for a lot of women, especially for women that have experienced some kind of trauma like that before, to operate in that hyper vigilant state, which is obviously not healthy. Um, but having knowledge and situational awareness could be something that might put their minds at a little bit more ease. I don't know that we're there as a society. In fact, I think we're moving backwards for women to feel like they can feel truly at ease. But at least with that knowledge in hand, it might help alleviate some of that anxiety they feel in certain situations when they're interacting with the public.
Yeah, that's one of it's one of the messages that we give when we do prevention work is like letting them know like the risk reduction things that women are taught to do. Great. If that makes you feel more comfortable, awesome. Please continue to do those. But if we're doing prevention and we're stopping at risk reduction, that's not prevention because someone is still going to be hurt somewhere. Maybe it's just not that person. So totally get the risk reduction pieces of it because that's an important piece to making yourself feel more comfortable in navigating spaces on your day-to-day life. So then, Ashley, when it comes to the flip side of this, the conversations that we have in true crime, where we're using these victim stories to potentially draw in a crowd to listen or to engage in some way with these victim stories, how is it that victim stories and experiences end up getting told in a way that's kind of disrespectful or re-traumatizing for some people listening? Again, that's not all true crime, right? Like your podcast is a great example of a way to share stories for victims and survivors in respectful ways. But how do these stories tend to, or how easy is it for someone to kind of fall into those traps?
Before I started my podcast, I really enjoyed listening to true crime, watching true crime. It was all I did, that and horror. And if I listened to a podcast and they made light of something, it would give me pause and I'd be like, that feels icky. But it wasn't something that I thought about really intensely until I started my podcast. And a couple months in, a mother approached me to cover a case. Her daughter was murdered by her boyfriend. And that was a really difficult and probably one of the most life-changing experiences for me because one, I wasn't like emotionally prepared for that. So I had to like train myself to not get very sucked into that. Um, but just to see how it impacted her, having to talk about it every day, how it impacted her to hear other people talking about it and talking about her daughter in a way that wasn't true, to see her cry, to look at the autopsy photos, it really changed who I was fundamentally and the way that I looked at true crime. And after that, I stopped listening to pretty much every single true crime podcast that I listened to. I now think a lot of them are awful. And I won't say their name because I'm not, trying to be petty, but in hindsight, looking back at the way they cover things is so insanely disrespectful from start to finish. And a lot of these podcasts make millions of dollars a year. And it's the way that they present the cases that are insanely unethical, but also why their podcasts are so wildly popular because they're not victim focused. They're focused on the gory details of the crime. And they're really, a lot of them kind of like glamorize the perpetrator and focus more on the perpetrator and what they do and less of the victim. So I think that happens a lot. And I've heard about it from friends that I have who I've covered cases on behalf of their loved ones that have either passed or something has happened to them where there's, a true crime content creator on TikTok with like 8 million followers who covered my mom's or my friend's case about her mom that was murdered 30 years ago. And he covered it, making her look like it was her fault. And I remember she messaged me and it was traumatizing to her. And that's so common for people to take these stories, sensationalize it. 9 times out of 10 people don't even bother reaching out to victims. If it's a mainstream case, I'll cover it. If it's a smaller case, I'll reach out to the victim's family. And if they don't respond or give me permission, I will not cover it because I don't want to do that, especially if it's fresh. And I try to really keep the families involved. Details they want in, details they want out that are of course true. Things that they want me to mention, maybe like a call to action. I think it's really important instead of focusing on making the most sensational story, I think it's important to honor the victim and their family because this is something that doesn't leave them. And it's really traumatizing for them to see these cases get covered without any care.
I do. I like that you brought up some of the victim blaming pieces that tend to come up in some true crime too, because it's not so dissimilar to what victims of like domestic and sexual violence experience in real life, where they are often blamed because they were taught the risk reduction, but they didn't do it, or they froze up, or they ended up giving in because they knew if they didn't, they were going to die in that moment. So our society will very often blame victims for what they've experienced because they failed to protect themselves and not seeing that as a societal failure or the failure of the perpetrator doing something awful to this person. So hearing that it's coming also in the way that people are sharing these stories in true crime isn't shocking because we're trained as a society to already see somebody who's a victim of a crime to put some of the blame back on them.
Yeah. And that's something I try to negate. There's one case I can think of about a woman who was murdered in Connecticut decades ago. And her husband was abusive for a long time. So, one of the most common cases is, well, why didn't she leave? They had children. And so I went into a whole background of the trauma bonding, that cycle, how it's literally very similar in terms of reward pathway and its impact on the brain than if someone were to start using heroin or an opioid. It chemically changes your brain and you become truly addicted to that cycle. Not only that, but there's also other complicated things with society, especially back then, women and autonomy. But that was like one of the most common things that people would say, well, she married somebody who was kind of a player, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, why isn't the question, why did that man beat his wife and then kill her? Why is the question, why did she do this? And it drives me absolutely insane.
And like now I'm thinking about like in horror movies, right? Even I said the victim blamey things, right? Why are you running up the stairs, dummy? Like, why are you going into that room, dummy? And it's in that horror movie, in all of those horror movies, we focus on that. We don't focus on why did Michael Myers decide to start killing people in Halloween or whatever. We focus on the actions that happen. And we don't blame Michael Myers for being a serial killer because that's who he is. That's just what he does, right? And then you get so many people who have like an obsession with that killer, with that um, gory detail, with the people who want the villains to win, things like that. And if you're one of those people, I'm not trying to like shame you into like not having your villain kink, whatever, do you? But how do we get there? Like as a society where we're thinking more about blaming that victim, telling the person running up the stairs that they're stupid, than thinking about like, well, why is the serial killer killing?
Patriarchy and a lot of years of social conditioning to blame victims and look at them as weak instead of what they are, a victim.
Oh,
Yeah,
let me tell you,
absolutely.
Amanda, I fully understand why Jigsaw does what he does. And he's justified, at least in Saw 4, when he starts hurting a bunch of people who are for healthcare insurance people, who are health insurance people. I think it's Saw 4. I think it's Saw 4.
I don't know the Saw movies, so I
So
can't.
Saw is my favorite series. I understand why John Kramer does what he does. It's still bad to put people in games where they're going to kill, potentially hurt themselves or die. That's not good. It's a joke that he's justified, but I understand why he does it. Doesn't make it better for understanding it.
Yeah. And I think a good example is looking at the new Monster, the Ed Gein one, which I like. I've watched those. I didn't watch the Menendez brothers ones because that's like a touchy. That's a I was gonna say touchy subject for me, because I really
Da-dunch.
their story is awful. But I like Charlie Hunnam. You know, I watched Sons of Anarchy, so I was like, okay, I'll watch it. And I know it's a dramatization. I think a lot of people are up in arms because they think it's supposed to be true to it, and it's not. It's meant to be like kind of a little bit of truth woven in with true crime dramatics. But I was really confused by the choice of actor. I mean, he did a great job, but that's a beautiful man. And now you're casting an insanely handsome man as a sadistic killer and making him look like a sympathetic character, which I do feel horrible for how he was raised, how he grew up. He had schizophrenia. He did not get mental care, and that's awful. I can't imagine what it must be like to have untreated schizophrenia. You have voices in your head and you can't discern what's real and what's not, and that's awful. But they made people straight up feel bad for him and like just completely missed the point of the actions that he did, which I think is a pretty good analogy to what we're talking about today. But that's what sells in podcasts, shows, movies. Not the truth, but the dramatic pieces of
Yeah.
it.
It it brings up, I made a note of this because I wanted to make sure we talked about it, and it's a perfect segue. So thank you. Um, but looking at, I think when people are consuming true crime, they're expecting the truth and the true crime piece of it. But if we were to just tell people the truth about stuff, that's not going to get people engaged because the truth is often very boring. So, how do we spice this up to make sure people are going to want to consume this or going to want to engage with it? So, your true crime tends to start to veer a bit more into that over dramatization of what actually happened because that's how you get them. Or they'll focus, like you said earlier, on like the really gory details of it because that's what people want. So it ends up being a almost like you need the title card before the movie based on real events, not these are the real events. And I think that gets lost in a lot of people's engagement with true crime.
Yeah, well, people see based on real events and they think it means it's like factual from start to finish, but
Yeah. It's for those
Right.
of you
Like they
who's
just changed a couple names. Everything else is exactly how it actually
yeah.
happened.
for those of you who like horror films and know who Ed Gein is, using that as an example, Psycho, so Norman Bates, the guy from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the guy from Silence of the Lambs, they're all based on Ed Gein. Those are three very different characters. So, based on does not mean this is true or this is all of it. So, if we're looking at wanting to make really ethical true crime information for people to engage with because people are still going to engage with the media and true crime is an incredibly valuable form of media because it gives people the opportunity when done correctly to experience experiences they may not have to gain and build empathy for victims and survivors instead of on the flip side gaining empathy for the people who are doing the crime. So how can we look at if we wanted to start creating more really good and ethical true crime media? Where do you think we need to start?
I'd say the first place to start would be to get the victims' families involved. Not every case has to be covered 10,000 times. I realize those are the cases that sell, but everybody knows those stories. I think a big problem that we see with any news story or true crime is that there's always a group of people whose stories get left out because they're in the minority. If it's a blonde hair, blue-eyed woman that gets killed, the media will spread that like wildfire, like the Gabby Petito case. And I'm glad they did because it was monumental in helping the case get solved. And I'm happy that happened, truly. But the problem is that there are so many other cases like that where we might see a Black woman, an Indigenous woman, a trans woman, a gay man. These cases get thrown to the side starting from the top. Media doesn't give them coverage. Cops don't care. There's so much bias in police across the country that I've seen in every case that I've covered. And they might say that it doesn't impact their investigation, but you can read their notes and stuff and just you could just tell right away that they are biased and they're looking at through this at a biased lens and therefore their investigation is going to be biased. So I think, getting victims' families involved and especially lifting up those voices of people who people put to the side every day. And if a family tells you no, they don't want their story spoken about, then that no means no. Stop talking about it. This is not our story to tell. It's their story to tell with permission if they want it to be put out there. And I'd say get them involved. They don't have to steer the ship and tell you exactly what they want. In fact, I've never had a relative do that. They've always said, we trust you, do whatever you want, but just please add this in. And then that's it. It's quite easy working with victims' families, but so many people just don't bother to do it. And stop using ChatGPT to add all of these really weird details that aren't actually involved in the case. But I think a lot of that too is there's a difference between like what's going to sell and get you really popular and also just being as painfully accurate and true to the story that you can be. And a lot of times those two don't mix. So I think people have to ask themselves what's more important, money, and nine times out of 10, that's what people are going to say. or truly trying to bring something positive to such a negative.
Yeah, one thing that Sean and I like to do, which I think would probably be beneficial to a lot of people who do true crime too, is when you're talking to that person, when you're talking to that victim or their family, ask them what they want to get out of it. Because are you looking for help trying to solve something? Are you looking for just awareness to get out there? Are you looking for accountability for people who are doing these actions? What is it that you are hoping for out of this? And let's curate toward that, because that's what this should be about, is for them.
Yeah, we always want to try to make sure that when we off a victim coming on to share their story, that they're sharing the story in a way that's true to them and in a way that's not going to be like glamorizing of anything that happened, because we want their story to be theirs and share it in their words. So if their goal of sharing their story is to educate or to bring awareness to what happened to them, perfect. We can guide our questions, we can guide the conversation in that route. So while they're sharing their story, Amanda and I can highlight pieces for them to make sure the audience is taking that away. We're only ever there to help try to enhance and give that survivor the space to tell their story, not tell them how to tell it. And I want to point out, because you said it in there, it's very easy to work with victims' families,
It is.
because when it comes, especially with true crime, when it comes to working with victims' families, I would imagine there are going to be a lot of people, especially if you're focusing more on the people who have experienced bias while working with law enforcement, that they want their stories told. They want their loved ones' stories to be heard by people and heard in a way that's correct. So reaching out to victims and family members, I'd be willing to imagine that if they know the person who's going to be sharing this story is going to take the proper steps necessary to make sure it's shared in the correct way, they would have no problem working with them.
Exactly. And I also have the policy too, if there's somebody else in the story that's related to it, if they ever reached out to me and said, "Hey, I actually hate this," I would immediately take the episode down and apologize to them, no questions asked. I know a lot of true crime podcasts will never take an episode down. I actually covered a story early on for the niece of the case, and one of the things that I ran into when I was listening to podcasts about it is they blamed her so much, and she was brutally murdered by her ex. And I was so truly confused, but that was the narrative. And I did try to look for her daughter, but I couldn't find her. And one day, maybe like a year or two later, she reached out to me on Instagram, and my heart dropped because I was like, oh my God, I hope. I was scared that like I missed something, or I didn't do it right, or I didn't do it in a positive light. And she like thanked me and ended up saying that I was like the first podcast to cover it appropriately. But I was like ready to get yelled at and say, "I'm really sorry, I'll take it down," which 100% of the time I would do. And I think that's big too, because if your episode is doing more harm than good, what is the sense of keeping it up other than you want to maintain ad revenue?
Yeah, and that the ad revenue or making money is the other piece of this. We always joke because we work for nonprofits, no one does our job because they want to make money. If you're looking at starting a true crime podcast because you want to make money, cool. That's what you want to do, right? But are you sacrificing telling stories in a way that's respectful to the survivors or the victims of these stories? Or are you willing to do the very minimal extra amount of legwork to make sure that those stories are being told in a way that's respectful of everybody? So that way it's the best of both worlds. You get to make money, but you also get to make sure these survivors and victims' stories are being told in a way that's respectful. And that should really kind of be the goal. But that's also me coming from a place of working with victims.
No, I agree. I mean, I'd love to make money off my podcast because there are production costs and stuff, but I will never sacrifice my formatting And that's something people have said to me over the years 100 times. If you cover more cases like this, you'll make much more money and you'll blow up way more. And I'm like, yeah, but I'd also feel I can't sleep for shit. I don't need guilt in addition to that because it'll just make my insomnia worse. Like there's no amount of money, unfortunately, that will ever negate me doing shitty things. Like that's just not how my brain works. I can't be like an evil genius, you know? So I'm
I
sacrificing growing and making more, but at the same time, I feel good being able to bring people like even just a small amount of peace, even though it might not get anywhere. Just letting them tell their story. I'm just grateful to be able to do that.
also I feel you. I sleep for shit and could never be an
Yeah.
evil genius. It would
Nope.
be awesome. I'm sure it'd be
Oh,
very
for sure.
profitable. I'm sure it'd be very profitable,
Mhm.
but could never happen.
Damn feelings.
Why do I have to have empathy?
Literally. I ask myself that every day.
So I was going to say, if you are a person out there who is a consumer of true crime podcasts, true crime documentaries, whatever it is, um, you know, you could do a little bit of legwork yourself and try and seek out the the shows who are doing things in an ethical way, who are doing things that promote, like you said, that little bit of positivity in a really negative situation, and not just look for the shock value and the glamour of the gore and things like that. So, as a consumer, you hold a lot of power in making sure that those ethical podcasts get the time and attention that they deserve as well.
Yeah. And something I say to my listeners a lot too. I try to give a call to action, especially if I'm working with relatives in the case. And I say, listen, we all have morbid curiosity. There's nothing wrong with us enjoying listening to things like this if we're doing it in a responsible way. But the least we could do is give back to the community in some sense. So you could share this story. Find this person on TikTok, get the story out there. Sometimes I have people write in to pressure sheriff's departments to maybe reopen a case or look into it more. Um, write somebody in local government to maybe look into the case. So I think it's really important if we're going to be consuming content like this to maybe try to give back, even if it's in a really small way of telling somebody about an open case or sharing a missing persons flyer, just really small things.
Well, I think that's something that gets often lost too when it comes to true crime media. True crime media is one of the very few that you can engage with outside of just that media that you're consuming and potentially do good with it, right? Like you could reach out to the sheriff's office, be like, "Hey, maybe keep looking into this." Um, we've seen it a few times in the news where it's like because uh, a story got picked up by true crime podcasters or people who participate in true crime, like they got people to start looking more into it again to help kind of push them to solve it. Not that the true crime podcasters are the ones solving the crimes, but they're pushing people to pick it back up, to look more into it. And it's one of the very few forms of media that you could do that with.
Exactly.
So one of the things that has come up kind of, but not like obviously specifically addressed, is a lot of the stories that you've mentioned were typically domestic violence situations. So this was not a question that we had planned for you, Ashley. But when it comes to true crime and the stories that you either have like heard of or are sharing on your podcast, how often is there that overlap of domestic violence?
Almost every time. I don't think people realize how common domestic violence has become for both men and women. And I don't think people realize how insidious it is and how hard it is for people to be taken seriously when they say that they're experiencing domestic violence, especially if it's something like just maybe verbal or environmental abuse, which is just as damaging and scary and threatening as physical abuse. But that is a common point in almost, I can't think of any case where there hasn't been some kind of abuse, be it child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, trafficking. I mean, it's pretty much a common theme across every case, unfortunately.
Yeah, and and the reason that I bring it up is because there's that perfect, almost that Venn diagram is almost a perfect circle of the stories that you're going to be sharing and the survivor stories that are coming onto our podcast here. Because there's something about domestic violence or just violence in general that in our society we've just learned to overlook it, and we only then tend to see it when we want to. And that part comes from, oh, well, I want to watch this horror film. I'm fine with seeing violence here. I'll listen to this true crime podcast because that's how I want to consume the media. When we have violence so often in every form of media that we're consuming, we've become desensitized to violence in our society. Now, that's not to say do not consume this media. I'm still going to watch horror movies. As of recording this, tomorrow is Halloween. I will be watching Saw. But we cannot allow the media that we're consuming to desensitize us to violence, because then you get people who will consume true crime solely because that's what they just want to listen to, and solely because they have that morbid curiosity. They're not consuming true crime and hearing it and also taking away from that empathy for the victim.
And I think, unfortunately, if I'm being candid, that's probably 50% or more of the people that think of true crime. I can think of one true crime podcast that I will not directly name here, but I'm sure people will know what I'm talking about. It's a very popular true crime podcast hosted by a male that has made fun of victims of rape and has doxed victims that have been raped in court documents that are anonymous. And they are one of the most popular true crime podcasts. They have millions of listeners. And the amount of times that I've heard that man making fun of women getting raped and murdered. One time he posted a tweet asking, I think it was like, if you were to see a woman get raped or if you were to see a woman get murdered, which race would you prefer she would be? And then it was like white, Black, Native American, Asian. And this man still has a massive platform, which I think is terrifying and also really telling that there are a lot of people out there that are really just fucked in the head and want to listen to this for very nefarious purposes.
Anybody can have a podcast, and I'm tired of mediocre men being the ones that get the most listens.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Listen, that's coming from a guy who tends to believe he's mediocre, just slightly above average. So,
And I'm
but
all for men having a podcast. Just
yeah,
try to do something positive, like at one episode a month. Maybe just don't
yeah,
make fun of rape victims. I like at a bare
right.
minimum. I don't know.
Like that bar is so fucking low, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're running a true crime podcast, your job is sharing stories of people who have experienced incredibly awful things. And for you to then turn around and continually minimize the stories of the victims that you're sharing alone is not only incredibly irresponsible, because you're then building a very large viewership of people who are also going to diminish and demean and ignore victims and survivors or not care about them when they happen, but also potentially enable them to feel like, yeah, I can do these things.
Oh, for sure. There's a lot of enabling to do things like that going on all around us.
So thank you for joining us today, Ashley. Before we sign out, though, is there anything that you would like to let our audience know or any final thoughts you want to give them?
Consume true crime content ethically, but I am assuming, just based on your podcast, that these people probably are very ethical.
We would hope so, but
Yeah.
So, Ashley, if they were looking to find you on social media or to listen to your podcast, where could they find you?
F that pod on TikTok, F that underscore pod on Instagram. My podcast is called Fuck That, but it's F asterisk asterisk K because naughty words are not allowed on podcasts for their titles.
Yeah, unfortunately. But I will make sure I link all of those in the show notes. So please check out Ashley's Fuck That podcast. I've listened to a few episodes. They're phenomenal.
Thank you.
So thank you again for joining us today, Ashley. And thank you all for listening today. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Touchy Subs Pod to keep up to date when we have new episodes and other content coming out. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really does help the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.